Hello there. This is episode number 2 of the Modern Military History Podcast. Today, I'm going to bring to you a selection of readings from a truly amazing book by Christopher Browning. I have really put some thought into what I want to say about this book. And quite frankly, I'm going to let the book speak for itself. Christopher Browning does an amazing job here at bringing you inside the mind of somebody who is led down a very dark path. The Order Police did horrible things in the name of the final solution during the Second World War. The Order Police loaded trains headed for murder camps, concentration camps, work camps, ghettos. They shot women and children indiscriminately. They filled mass graves without seemingly remorse. Christopher Browning delves into exactly how men can be brought to that state, how that comes about, and he does it through history and a meticulous study of the 1960s court transcripts of members of Police Battalion 101 being tried for their heinous war crimes. The commander of Police Battalion 101 was indeed sentenced to death in the late 1950s. In the previous podcast, I read from Viktor Frankl and his account of what it was like to be inside the wire and be a prisoner. While Viktor Frankl certainly had some harsh words for his captors, I know that he made an effort on some level to try to understand them. But of course his work is ultimately biased. He served in the camps. He was beaten and imprisoned. And his outlook is perfectly justified. I think it's also equally as important the work that Browning has done to bring the minds and actions of the perpetrators to a human light and bring it to a level that we can, hopefully, with a type of objective detachment, observe, and then reflect back on ourselves and our own actions. As I said, I've thought a lot about what I want to say about this book, and I'm reaching the end of my thoughts. This book speaks for itself. And if what you like here in the excerpts I choose to read move you as they have moved me, then I highly, highly recommend purchasing this book and reading it. My only advice is don't read it before bed. My habit is personally that I enjoy reading before I go to sleep. But this book did give me nightmares. And I've read a lot of history, most of it, in those hours before I turn off my light and commit myself to dreams. But this book, in its humanity, in its meticulously accurate research, and in the way that Browning writes, put me often in a very disturbing place. I've gone through and found a variety of excerpts that, for the most part, are chronological throughout the book, but I did not hold myself specifically to that rule. I want to end my podcast today with a reading from the prologue, as a matter of fact. So don't take this podcast as a be-all, end-all for this work. If this podcast speaks to you, then again, I urge you to purchase the book. The first selection of this book I'm going to read really articulates the ludicrous nature of defining certain types of humans by race, or saying certain kinds of people are okay to shoot. Other people are deemed more worthy of life than others. It's just absurd. And the insanity of that ideology is really noticeable here in this first selection of the book. And this is talking about how the Order Police, not just Police Battalion 101, but the Order Police as a general organization, all the battalions, how they started down their dark path, and that was in Russia, in the very opening stages of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when the Nazis invaded the Russian steppe and almost immediately began pacifying the captured areas. And the Order Police were crucial to this. But the Order Police actually inaugurated their murderous career in Russia before this massive buildup in the later part of July. The site was the nearly half-Jewish city of Belyask. On the eve of the German invasion of Russia, dubbed Operation Barbarossa, Major Weiss of Police Battalion 309 met with his company commanders. As in every other unit of the German army and the police moving into Russia, he disclosed several orders that were to be passed on to the men verbally. The first was the notorious Kommissar Befehl, or Commissar Order, according to which so-called political commissars, all communist functionaries in the army, as well as those in the civil administration suspected of being in any way anti-German, were to be denied prisoner of war status and executed. The second order was the Barbarossa Decree, which removed the actions of German soldiers towards Russian civilians from the jurisdiction of military courts and explicitly approved collective reprisal against entire villages. This was, in fact, a shooting license against Russian civilians. Major Weiss then went further. The war, he said, was a war against Jews and the Bolsheviks, and he wanted it understood that the battalion should proceed ruthlessly against Jews. In his view, the meaning of the Führer's orders was that the Jews, regardless of age or sex, were to be destroyed. After entering the city of Belyask, Major Weiss, on June 27, ordered his battalion to comb the Jewish quarter and seize male Jews. But he did not specify what was to be done with them. That was apparently left to the initiative of the company captains, who had been oriented to his way of thinking in the pre-invasion meeting. The action began as a pogrom: beating, humiliation, beard burning, and shooting at will as the policemen drove Jews to the marketplace or synagogue. When several Jewish leaders appeared at the headquarters of the 221st Security Division of General Flugbel and knelt at his feet begging for army protection, one member of Police Battalion 309 unzipped his fly and urinated on them while the general turned his back. What started as a pogrom quickly escalated into more systematic mass murder. Jews collected at the marketplace were taken to a park, lined up against a wall, and shot. The killing lasted until dark. At the synagogue, where at least 700 Jews had been collected, gasoline was poured on the entryways. A grenade was tossed into the building, igniting a fire. Police shot anyone trying to escape. The fire spread to nearby houses in which Jews were hiding, and they too were burned alive. The next day, 30 wagon loads of corpses were taken to a mass grave. An estimated 2,000 to 2,200 Jews had been killed. When General Flugbel sent a messenger to Major Weiss to inquire about the fire, the major was found drunk. He claimed to know nothing about what was happening. Weiss and his officers subsequently submitted a false report of the events to Flogbel. And that is the first selection I have from this book, and it is truly shocking. And what it shows, and why I wanted to start with this selection, is that before they even entered Russia, there was a precedent of barbarity and cruelty, seemingly indiscriminately. Not just Jews were to be brutalized, but seemingly anybody, any white Russian, for any reason, could be shot, tortured, or mutilated, and there would be no judicial reprisals against the German soldiers. And I think that mindset, that freedom to act in a way, sets a precedent and begins the first of many steps on a very dark path. It's very easy to read passages like the former and demonize, dehumanize, and only place yourself in the burning synagogue rather than outside of it. Christopher Browning does a really impactful job at humanizing these killers. And as he delves into the Police Battalion 101, he, through the use of court documents, is able to paint a very accurate picture of the types of people, the types of men that made up this unit and made up other order police units. The second selection is found on page 47. Of the rank and file, the vast majority were from the Hamburg area. About 63% were of working class background, but few were skilled laborers. The majority of them held typical Hamburg working class jobs. Dock workers and truck drivers were the most numerous, but there were also many warehouse and construction workers, machine operators, seamen, and waiters. About 35% were lower middle class. Virtually all of them white-collar workers. 3/4 were in sales of some sort. The other 1/4 performed various office jobs in both the government and private sector. The number of independent artisans and small businessmen was very small. Only a handful were middle-class professionals, about 2%, and very modest ones at that, such as druggists and teachers. The average age of the men was 39. Over half were between 37 and 42, a group considered too old for the army, but most heavily conscripted for reserve police duty after September of 1939. So there you have it. A very disturbingly human portrait of these men. Back to the book. Unable to satisfy his manpower needs out of local resources, Globoknik prevailed upon Himmler to recruit non-Polish auxiliaries from the Soviet border regions. The key person on Globoknik's Operation Reinhard staff for this task was Karl Streibel. He and his men visited the POW camps and recruited Ukrainian, Latvian, and Lithuanian volunteers, in parentheses. Hilfswege, or Hiwis, who were screened on the basis of their anti-communist and hence almost invariably anti-Semitic sentiments, offered an escape from probable starvation and promised that they would not be used in combat against the Soviet army. These volunteers, again in parentheses, were taken to the SS camp at Troniki for training. Under German SS officers and ethnic German non-commissioned officers, they were formed into units on the basis of nationality. Alongside the order police, they constituted the second major manpower pool from which Glabachnik could perform his private armies for the ghetto clearing campaign. These Hiwis that Christopher Browning describes here come up time and time again in the book, especially when the Germans see the toll that acts of brutality take upon the men. They use these Hiwis, often provided with ample supplies of vodka and always drunk. They made them do the most heinous acts and spared the German soldiers from the psychological trauma of shooting women and children. This is just another example of the insanity of this racial war the Nazis were waging. And I will specify what I mean, because previously we heard about the essentially open fire order given to the armies as they entered Russia. And here they're recruiting the people that they gave license to shoot to do the shooting. It's contradictory, hypocritical, just like all of the Nazis' racial policies. Back to the book. As with the first company, alcohol was made available to the policemen under Drucker and Steinmetz, who stayed in the forest and continued shooting. As the darkness approached at the end of the long summer day and the murderous task was still not finished, the shooting became even less organized and more hectic. The forest was so full of dead bodies, it was difficult to find places to make the Jews lie down. When darkness finally fell, about 9 p.m., some 17 hours after Reserve Police Battalion 101 had first arrived at the outskirts of Józefów, and the last Jews had been killed, the men returned to the marketplace and prepared to depart for Bilgoraj. No plans had been made for the burial of the bodies, and the dead Jews were simply left lying in the woods. Neither clothing nor valuables had been officially collected, although at least some of the policemen had enriched themselves with watches, jewelry, and money taken from the victims. The pile of luggage the Jews had been forced to leave at the marketplace was simply burned. Before the policemen climbed into the trucks and left Józefów, a 10-year-old girl appeared, bleeding from the head. She was brought to Trap, the commander, who took her in his arms and said, "You shall remain alive." When the men arrived at the barracks in Bilgoraj, they were depressed, angered, embittered, and shaken. They ate little but drank heavily. Generous quantities of alcohol were provided, and many of the policemen got quite drunk. Major Trapp began the rounds, trying to console and reassure them, and again placing the responsibility on higher authorities. But neither the drink nor Trapp's consolation could wash away the sense of shame and horror that pervaded the barracks. Trapp asked the men not to talk about it, but they needed no encouragement in that direction. Those who had not been in the forest did not want to learn more. Those who had been there likewise had no desire to speak, either then or later. By silent consensus within Police Battalion 101, the Józefów massacre was simply not discussed. The entire matter was a taboo. But repression during waking hours could not stop the nightmares. During the first night back from Józefów, one policeman awoke, firing his gun into the ceiling of the barracks. And that is the first of the selections I've chosen from this book that discuss the copious use of alcohol to numb the men in a seemingly contradictory acknowledgement of the evil they were committing. If the Jews were meant to die, then why did the German hierarchy seem it necessary for the men to numb their emotions? Again, the lunacy and the hypocrisy of this war on humanity comes to the surface. Back to the book. At Józefów, a mere dozen men out of nearly 500 had responded instinctively to Major Trapp's offer to step forward and excuse themselves from the impending mass murder. Why was the number of men who from the beginning declared themselves unwilling to shoot so small? In part, it was a matter of the suddenness. There was no forewarning or time to think, as the men were totally surprised by the Józefów action. Unless they were able to react to Trapp's offer on the spur of the moment, this first opportunity was lost. As important as the lack of time for reflection was the pressure for conformity, the basic identification of men in uniform with their comrades, and the strong urge not to separate themselves from the group by stepping out. The battalion had only recently been brought up to full strength, and many of the men did not yet know each other well. The bonds of military comradeship were not yet fully developed. Nonetheless, the act of stepping out that morning at Józefów meant leaving one's comrades and admitting that one was too weak or cowardly. Who would have dared, one policeman declared empathetically, to lose face before the assembled troops? If the question is posed to me why I shot with the others in the first place, said another, who subsequently asked to be excused after several rounds of killing, I must answer that no one wants to be thought a coward. It is one thing to refuse at the beginning, he added, and quite another to try to shoot but still not be able to continue. Another policeman, more aware of what was truly required courage, said quite simply, I was cowardly. And that right there is part of what makes this book so incredible. It's Christopher Browning breaking down the group mentality and the basic human psychology that makes these men act, because at this massacre I have read selections of, this massacre at Józefów, the police battalion commander, Major Trapp, actually offered that any man who didn't want to participate in the killing could step out. And only a few men did, and they were all pretty seriously reprimanded on the spot, despite the major saying that it was okay for them to step out. This group politics, in a way, is something people rarely take into consider when they demonize these men. And it makes you ask, what would you do? Because, as these policemen say, no one wants to be called a coward in front of his friends. Back to the book. This is a quotation from one of the men who participated in the Józefów massacre. As follows: I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbor then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers. End quote. Again, there's Christopher Browning bringing to you, without any kind of barrier, the thoughts of one of these men who committed some of the most heinous acts of this atrocity. How he reasoned his dark path Back to the book. The NCOs were told that the Hiwis from Traniki would do the shooting, so the policemen would for the most part be spared. Nonetheless, the roundup was to be conducted as had been done before, which is to say that infants and the old, sick and frail, who could not be easily taken to the assembly point, were to be shot on the spot. According to one squad leader, however, most children were once again brought to the assembly point. As in Józefów, the men encountered not only German Jews, but specifically Hamburg Jews during the clearing action. The Jews quickly filled the schoolyard and overflowed into the adjoining sports field. With some shooting, the roundup was finished in a short 2 hours. The 1,700 Jews of Lomazi were then forced to sit and wait. A group of 60 to 70 young men were selected out, given shovels and spades, loaded into trucks, and driven to the woods. Several of the young Jews jumped from the moving trucks and made good their escape. Another attacked a German corporal, the battalion boxing champion, who promptly knocked his desperate assailant senseless. In the woods, the Jews were set to work digging a mass grave. That selection is from the second action that Police Battalion 101 took part in. And lessons from the first action at Józefów had been applied. The Ukrainian and ethnic Hiwis from Traniki were used to do the most heinous of the acts, because it was apparent from the Józefów massacre that the Police Battalion 101 men were deeply affected by the horror of what they had done. And also, I wanted to share that selection because for the first time in the book, there's an instance of nonconformity on behalf of the Jews. Up until this point, all the massacres were executed rather smoothly. There was no resistance on behalf of the victims. And that may be something that you and I can find surprising with our present knowledge, but it also makes us ask the question, if you look a little deeper, what would I have done? Would I have angled for a few more minutes of life in the face of imminent death by being compliant and hoping, praying for mercy? Or would have I used those last few minutes to be defiant? And I can say I still don't know what I would do. And I really try not to judge or put myself in a situation I've never been and hope never to be. Back to the book. The Hiwis, often with bottle in hand, as well as Nade and the SS officer, became increasingly drunk, while First Lieutenant Nade shot with his pistol from the dirt wall, whereby he was in constant danger of falling into the grave. The SD officer climbed into the grave, just like the Hiwis, and shot from there. Because he was so drunk, he could no longer stand on the wall. Groundwater mixed with blood began to rise in the grave, so that the Hiwis were soon standing in it over their knees. The number of shooters steadily diminished as one by one the Hiwis fell into a drunken stupor. Nade and the SS officer then began to scream reproaches at one another loudly enough to be heard by all, standing within 30 meters of the grave. The SS officer yelled, "Your shit police don't shoot at all." Nade retorted, "Good, then my men will have to shoot too." Again, a brief vignette from one of these atrocities which Police Battalion 101 took part in. And Browning brings to this book not only the men who had obvious objections with conducting the killing, but also the men who seemingly rejoiced in it as well. And this Lieutenant Nade, which is named multiple times until he is actually killed in action in 1944, took sadistic pleasure at every opportunity in humiliating and murdering Jews. And also that selection brings the ever-present use of alcohol to the forefront. It seems necessary that alcohol was there to release the psychological burden from the killers from murdering innocent humans en masse. Christopher Browning delves specifically into that point here in the next selection of the book. Psychologically, the burden on the killers was much reduced. The Hiwis not just liquored up after the event to help them forget, but drunk from the start, did most of the shooting. According to Sergeant Bentham, his men were overjoyed that they were not required to shoot this time. Those spared such direct participation seem to have had little, if any, sense of participation in the killing. After Józefów, the roundup and guarding of Jews to be killed by someone else seemed relatively innocuous. For Buckman, Talcon was the final straw. On the afternoon he returned, the desk clerk tried to report to him, but he had immediately gone to his room and locked himself in. For days, Buckman would neither talk to me, although we knew each other well. He was angry and complained bitterly, saying something to the effect, "Now I won't do this shit any longer. I have a nose full." And that was a quote from Buckman's desk clerk, who goes unnamed in the book. Back to the book. Buckman was not only complained. In late September, he wrote directly to Hamburg, urgently requesting a transfer. He could not carry out tasks, quote, alien to the police, end quote, that his unit was being given in Poland. If Buckman's behavior was tolerated and protected by Trapp, it received mixed reactions from his men. In quotes again, "Among my subordinates many understood my position, but others made disparaging remarks about me and looked down their noses at me." End quote. A few men in the ranks followed his example, however, and told the company first Sergeant Kammer, quote, that they were neither able nor willing to take part in such actions anymore, end quote. Kammer did not report them. Instead, he yelled at them, calling them, quote, shitheads who were, quote, good for nothing, end quote. But for the most part, he freed them from participating in further Jewish actions. In doing so, Kammer was following the example Trapp had set from the beginning. As long as there was no shortage of men willing to do the murderous job at hand, it was much easier to accommodate Buckman in the men who emulated him than to make trouble over them. And I think that right there is a very important distinction that Browning brings to his work. The fact that although men, and not a small minority of these men, had no desire to participate in the killing, and they also had apparently no issue expressing it, despite being called cowards and weak, often directly to their face, as Buckman's quote here clearly shows. And also, as that last sentence articulates, as long as there were men willing to do the job, what did it matter that some stepped out? They did nothing to stop the events, only protect their own sense of virtue and morality. I don't know about you, but I don't know what's worse, letting it happen or doing it. Back to the book. 25 years later, Wolfgang Hoffman claimed to remember absolutely nothing of the Konstwahlka action, in which one 1,100 to 1,600 Jews had been killed in a single day by policemen under his command. His amnesia may have been grounded not only in judicial expediency, but also in the health problems he was experiencing during his assignment in Puławy. At the time, Hoffman blamed his illness on a dysentery vaccine that he had taken in late August. In the 1960s, he found it more convenient to trace his illness to the psychological stress of the Józefów massacre. Whatever the cause, Hoffman began to suffer from diarrhea and severe stomach cramps in September and October 1942. By his own account, his condition, diagnosed as vegetative colitis, was terribly aggravated by bumpy movement, as on a bicycle or in a car, and thus he personally led few of his company's actions at this time. Nonetheless, out of, quote, soldierly enthusiasm, end quote, and the hope of improvement, he refused to report his illness until the end of October. Only on November 2 did he enter the army hospital on doctor's orders. Uniformly, Hoffman's men offered a different perspective. By their observation, his, quote, alleged, end quote, bouts of stomach cramps confined him safely to bed, coincided all too consistently with company actions that might involve either unpleasantness or danger. It became common for the men to predict upon hearing the night before a pending action that the company chief would be bedridden by morning. Skipping ahead in the book. Certainly Hoffman's duties aggravated his condition. Moreover, it is clear that rather than using his illness to escape an assignment that involved killing the Jews in Poland, Hoffman made every effort to hide it from his superiors and to avoid being hospitalized. If mass murder was giving Hoffman stomach pains, it was a fact he was deeply ashamed of and sought to overcome to the best of his ability. That selection right there is rather close to home for me because I suffer from a spastic colon, and that's what my doctor termed it. However, it's still a relatively unknown condition today in modern science. Now I know this isn't a medical podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but I hope you'll indulge me for a minute because I have personal experience with this. There's an incredible amount of neural transmitters linked with your gut. And that's why a lot of people will experience anxiety physically in their diaphragm. I won't get too personal with my life story, but there have been times where I've experienced incredible stress. Often it was a watershed of multiple events leading up to a culmination of almost unbearable anxiety. During those times when I didn't understand my anxiety, I found myself bedridden with intense stomach pains. If I could put my pain level on a scale of 1 to 10, my stomach pain was at an 8 or a 9. Unbearable to the point that I couldn't get up certain points of the day. And even laying down was almost unbearably uncomfortable. It's as though your entire gut is filled with fiery lead and is burning you from the inside out. It seems that Hoffman experienced something very similar. And although Browning, as a very thorough historian and academic who has no medical training, does not make any assertions here, which I applaud him for, it shows his academic restraint, I would say that this condition was almost certainly psychologically induced. For me personally, I haven't had this stomach pain since I really started taking responsibility for my anxiety. And that is a personal matter I don't want to get into. But here is Hoffman obviously ashamed of and remaining despite his illnesses. But his illnesses are continuing to reoccur, showing a subconscious issue with his orders. I don't want to delve too deeply into the psychoanalytics of these men, but I will say Hoffman is doing what other officers have done, including the Major Trapp who commands the unit, in that he directly gives the responsibility of these heinous actions he cannot personally do himself to his men. And the men notice. In terms of leadership, Hoffman gets an F. He's leaving his men to do the dirty work. And he's using his spastic colon as an excuse, not only to avoid owning the fact that he disagrees with the actions, but also to avoid committing the actions himself. Back to the book. By October, the order was for real. Placards announced that all Jews who did not go to the ghettos would be shot. The shooting order was made part of regular company instructions to the men and given repeatedly, especially before they were sent on patrol. No one could be left in any doubt that not a single Jew was to remain alive in the battalion's security zone. In official jargon, the battalion made forest patrols for, quote, suspects, as the surviving Jews were to be tracked down and shot like animals. However, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 officially dubbed this phase of the final solution the Judenjagd, or Jew hunt. The Jew hunt took many forms. Most spectacular were 2 battalion sweeps through the Parskew Forest in the fall of 1942 and the spring of 1943, the latter alongside army units. Not only Jews, but partisans and escaped Russian prisoners of war were the targets of these sweeps, though Jews seem to have been the primary victims of the first one in October of 1942. Georg Leffler of 3rd Company recalled, "We were told that there were many Jews hiding in the forest. We therefore searched through the woods in a skirmish line, but could find nothing because the Jews were obviously well hidden. We combed the woods a second time. Only then could we discover individual chimney pipes sticking out of the earth. We discovered that Jews had hidden themselves in underground bunkers there. They were hauled out, with resistance in only one bunker. Some of the comrades climbed down into this bunker and hauled the Jews out. The Jews were then shot on the spot, and the Jews had to lie face down on the ground and were killed by a neck shot. Who was in the firing squad, I don't remember. I think it was simply a case where the men were standing nearby were ordered to shoot them. Some 50 Jews were shot, including men and women of all ages, because entire families had hidden themselves there. The shooting took place quite publicly. No cordon was formed at all, for a number of Poles from Parskew were standing directly by the shooting site. They were then ordered, presumably by Hoffman, to bury the Jews who had been shot in this half-finished bunker. I wanted to bring the details of the Judenjagd, or the Jew hunt, because it shows the barbarity and the inhumanity here on just an incredible scale. Back to the book. Concerning the eager killers, the wife of Lieutenant Brand remembered vividly one event during a visit to her husband in Poland. I was sitting at breakfast one morning with my husband in the garden of our lodgings when an ordinary policeman of my husband's platoon came up to us, stood stiffly at attention, and declared, "Herr Lieutenant, I have not yet had breakfast." When my husband looked at him quizzically, he declared further, I have not yet killed any Jews. It all sounded so cynical, and I indignantly reprimanded the man with harsh words and called him, if I remember correctly, a scoundrel. My husband sent the policeman away and then reproached me and told me that I'd get myself in deep trouble talking that way. The selections I've picked from this book are but vignettes that have stuck with me as I went through and absorbed this history. What really struck me was the amount of times I had to question things I thought I knew about myself if I had been placed in this kind of situation. I'd always thought that I would be somebody who would run away to the forest to subsist like a heroic nomad rather than go die in a ghetto. But here, I've read selections of people who did just that, and the issues of running away become apparent. How do you survive in a forest? How do you survive when people come to look for you? What do you do when winter sets in? More so, I found myself questioning what I would have done if I were one of the policemen. Would I have simply stepped out when given the chance? Would I have participated in the shooting until I had become physically incapacitated by my anxiety? Would I have been riddled by gut pains like Lieutenant Hoffman? From the prologue of the book, Christopher Browning states, "Another possible objection to this kind of study concerns the degree of empathy for the perpetrators that is inherent in trying to understand them. Clearly, the writing of such a history requires the rejection of demonization. The policemen in the battalion who carried out the massacres and deportations, like the much smaller number who refused or evaded, were human beings. I recognize that in the same situation, I could have been either a killer or an evader. Both were human. If I want to understand and explain the behavior of both as best I can. This recognition does not indeed mean an attempt to empathize. What I do not accept, however, are the old cliches that to explain is to excuse. To understand is to forgive. Explaining is not excusing. Understanding is not forgiving. Trying to understand the perpetrators in human terms would make impossible not only this history, but any history of Holocaust perpetrators that sought to go beyond one-dimensional caricature. Shortly before his death at the hands of the Nazis, the French Jewish historian Marc Bloch wrote, "When all is said and done, a single word, understanding, is the beacon light of our studies." It is in that spirit that I have tried to write this book. And that is the final selection I've picked from Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. It's a book where some empathy is inevitable, but also necessary to understand these events in a more objective light. Stay tuned. Next week I'll be bringing you another book and another podcast. Thank you for following me. And if you'd like to order this book, Ordinary Men, and if you too would like to question some serious aspects of yourself and of the history you thought you knew, then I suggest you buy it. I'll put a link in the description where you can support Christopher Browning. Thank you, and until next week.